The clock in the main hallway of Westbridge Academy ticked steadily, its brass casing gleaming under the chandelier's light. The Academy, older than the city itself, was a prestigious institution that had shaped senators, CEOs, and renowned judges. Each student here carried a name that mattered: old money families, political dynasties, or descendants of media moguls. Amidst these elites stood Ethan Sullivan, a boy who didn't belong to any of those categories. Room 214 was filled with students in perfectly pressed uniforms, their ties neat, their shoes polished. It was a classroom dedicated to political ethics and civics, one of the few subjects where debates were encouraged, but only within the confines of what the teacher wanted to hear. Standing before the class was Ms. Parker, the teacher who liked to play the devil's advocate, but never truly revealed her own stance. She had a way of making students squirm, constantly guessing what she actually believed or whether she just enjoyed watching them argue. Sharp, confident, and commanding without ever needing to raise her voice, Ms. Parker was known for pushing students into uncomfortable discussions. And today was no different. "You all need to ask yourselves, who's overseeing the press?" she said, leaning casually against the teacher's desk, her eyes scanning the room. The discussion had been going on for about 15 minutes, but the room's energy was slowly waning. Some students remained engaged, while others doodled absent-mindedly in their notebooks, waiting for the bell to signal freedom. Then Ms. Parker smiled, and when she smiled, it usually meant she was about to drop a bomb on the conversation. "The issue is," she continued, her tone calm, yet pointed, "some journalists aren't reporting the truth. They're selling what's easy to digest. Take Emily Sullivan, for example." The air in the room shifted instantly. A few students snickered, while others glanced at each other, recognizing the name that had just been mentioned. Emily Sullivan, Ethan's mother. Ethan didn't react immediately. His hands rested evenly on his notebook, his face an unreadable mask. But inside, he knew this moment all too well. It wasn't the first time his mother's name had come up in discussions like this, discussions held by people who didn't know her, who had never sat across from her at the dinner table, watching her push aside her meal to take a crucial call. They didn't understand how hard she had worked to secure a spot in a newsroom that hadn't exactly welcomed her with open arms. And Ethan knew Ms. Parker wasn't mentioning his mother by accident. She went on, her voice steady but sharp. "She doesn't care about the truth. She's just creating stories that divide people, all in the name of seeking the truth. But let's be honest, she doesn't care about the truth." A few students chuckled lightly, but not all of them. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, realizing the conversation had taken a more personal turn. Ethan remained still, his spine straight, his hands gripping his notebook. From a distance, he might have appeared completely composed. But upon closer inspection, you could see the way his jaw clenched, his fingers subtly pressing into the edge of his notebook. Ms. Parker paced slowly in front of the class, her voice low, but every word carried weight. "Journalism today isn't about seeking the truth anymore. It's about scandals, accusations, outrage. That's what people want, and that's what people like Emily Sullivan are selling: silence. The kind of silence that made the whole room feel like it was holding its breath." Ethan took a deep breath, then slowly lifted his head and stood up. The movement was deliberate, measured. No angry pounding of the desk, no outburst of words, just an eerily calm decision. The entire class froze. Ms. Parker raised an eyebrow, a slight smile curling on her lips. She thought she had won. She thought Ethan was about to embarrass himself. She was wrong. "With all due respect, Ms. Parker," Ethan's voice was steady, deep, but firm, "you don't know what you're talking about." The smile on her face disappeared. "My mother doesn't sell stories," Ethan continued. "She writes about issues that people in power want to hide. Stories that make them uncomfortable. And yes, that's what makes her unpopular with some people. But being hated by those in power doesn't make her wrong. Sometimes, it's proof that she's right." The room was dead silent. "You say she's just seeking attention," Ethan pressed, his voice unwavering. "But you weren't there when we had to move because of death threats. You weren't there when my mother sat at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., exhausted, but still double-checking every word of her article, because if she made one mistake, people like you would use it to invalidate her entire career." Ms. Parker was silent. The students around him no longer laughed. For the first time all semester, Ms. Parker had no sharp retort. Ethan didn't look triumphant. He simply gathered his books with quiet composure. The bell rang. But no one moved. Finally, Ms. Parker spoke, her voice slightly altered. "You make some valid points, Ethan. But journalism isn't just about finding the truth, it's about how the truth is presented. When a story creates more division than understanding, is it really serving its purpose? Ethan tilted his head slightly, his expression calm. Do you ask that question of all journalists? He asked. Or just the ones who say things you don't want to hear? A murmur rippled through the class. Miss Parker looked at Ethan for a long moment, as though considering something. But before she could respond, the second bell rang. Ethan turned and walked out of the classroom. He didn't need to say anything more. As Ethan walked out of the classroom, he felt the familiar weight of the hallway's silence pressing down on him. The bell had just rung, signaling the end of the period, but for some reason, no one moved. There was no rush, no chatter as the students filed out. It was as if the entire class was stuck in a moment of stillness, reflecting on what had just unfolded. Ethan didn't look back. He wasn't one to dwell on moments like this, especially not the ones where he'd had the last word. But as he made his way through the crowded halls of Westbridge Academy, he could feel the eyes on him. They were different this time, colder, more calculating. The kind of look that made him realize, perhaps for the first time, just how out of place he was in this school. He pushed open the heavy doors leading to the courtyard and stepped outside, the crisp autumn air hitting him like a wave. The campus stretched out before him, well-manicured lawns, grand stone buildings, and the constant hum of privileged voices echoing through the corridors. He didn't belong here, not in the way they did. They were all part of a legacy his mother had fought to infiltrate, not through blood or money, but through sheer determination. Ethan found his usual spot in the corner of the courtyard, under the large oak tree. It was a place he could be alone without being completely isolated. From here, he could watch the students as they moved in groups, laughing and talking about things that seemed so far removed from his reality. Things that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the messages. Nothing important, just texts from his mum, making sure he was doing okay. She always worried about him, even though he rarely showed it. Ethan hadn't told her about the conversation with Miss Parker, but he knew she'd ask him about it later, and when she did, he'd give her the same answer he always did. It's fine, Mum. I can handle it. But the truth was, he wasn't sure if he could handle it anymore. Not the whispers in the halls, not the way people looked at him like he was some kind of curiosity. Not the constant reminder that his mother's career, her choices, her very existence in this world of elites, made him a target. The sound of footsteps approaching broke his train of thought. He didn't look up right away, but the person stopped right in front of him. It was Claire Hartley. Claire was the epitome of everything Ethan wasn't. Blonde, perfectly styled, always surrounded by a group of friends who seemed to orbit her every move. She was everything he'd grown up being told he'd never be, a social butterfly, a leader, someone who belonged. If anyone at Westbridge could be called royalty, it was Claire. She stood there for a moment, hands in her pockets, her expression unreadable. Ethan couldn't quite place what it was about her that unsettled him. Maybe it was how effortlessly she fit in, or the way she never seemed to need approval. But now, for the first time, he noticed something different in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps? Or was it something else? So, that was interesting, Claire finally said, her voice light but with an edge that hinted at something more. Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at the ground, unsure of how to respond. Claire was one of the students who rarely engaged in these kinds of discussions, but her presence at moments like this always felt significant. She had a way of commanding attention without even trying. Do you always take on teachers like that? Claire asked, sitting down next to him without waiting for an invitation. Ethan turned to look at her, half surprised that she was sitting next to him, as if she was some sort of ally. But that idea felt odd. Claire didn't exactly strike him as someone who'd stand up for a guy like him. I don't take on teachers, he replied, his tone guarded. I just say what I think. Claire raised an eyebrow. And you think Miss Parker was wrong? Ethan hesitated, weighing his words carefully. He wasn't sure if he wanted to continue this conversation. But something about Claire's directness made him feel like he could trust her, even though he knew better than to fully let his guard down. She wasn't wrong about everything, Ethan said slowly. But she doesn't know the full story. She doesn't understand why my mum does what she does. Claire tilted her head, considering his words. I don't think anyone really understands why people like your mum do what they do. But she's controversial, right? And you have to admit, the way she goes about it isn't always the most diplomatic. Ethan stiffened at the mention of his mother's approach. Diplomatic? You think my mum's supposed to be diplomatic? Claire seemed to recognize the shift in his tone, and her expression softened. I didn't mean it like that, she said quietly. But there's a reason people don't like her. It's not just because of what she says. It's because of how she says it. People can't handle the truth if it's thrown in their faces. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He hadn't considered that perspective before. His mother had always been his hero, someone who fought for what was right, no matter the cost. But Claire had a point. People didn't always respond to truth the way they were supposed to. I get it, Claire continued, her voice quieter now. Your mum is brave, but not everyone is going to see it that way. Sometimes, it's easier to just let things go than to fight against the system. Ethan's jaw clenched. I don't know how to let things go. Not when I know she's right. Claire didn't say anything for a long moment, letting the words hang in the air between them. When she finally spoke, her tone was gentler, almost apologetic. I don't think you should have to let things go, Ethan, she said softly. But sometimes, fighting doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Maybe the battle isn't always about winning. Maybe it's about knowing when to walk away. Ethan turned to look at her then, really look at her. There was something different in her eyes now, something more sincere. Claire Hartley wasn't someone who typically engaged in deep conversations. But here she was, trying to make sense of something she didn't fully understand. For a moment, Ethan didn't know how to respond. But as the autumn breeze brushed through the trees and the noise of the campus faded into the background, he realized something important. Sometimes, it wasn't about changing minds. Sometimes, it was about holding on to what you knew was true, no matter what anyone else thought. The conversation with Claire lingered in Ethan's mind long after they parted ways in the courtyard. As much as he tried to dismiss it, her words echoed inside him. Sometimes, it's not about winning. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to walk away. He wasn't sure if he agreed, but for the first time, he wondered if there was more to his fight than just proving people wrong. Could there be another way to navigate this world without being consumed by it? Or was he doomed to keep playing the game the way his mother had taught him? Later that night, as Ethan sat at his desk, the weight of the day pressed on him. His homework lay untouched in front of him, a pile of unfinished assignments and essays he couldn't bring himself to care about. Instead, his mind kept drifting back to the conversation in class, to Claire's unexpected words, and to the silent tension that had filled the air after he stood up to Ms. Parker. His phone buzzed beside him, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from his mother, Emily Sullivan. How was your day, Ethan? Everything okay at school? It was a simple question, but it felt heavy. Ethan knew she was always trying to make sure he was handling everything well, but he also knew she could sense when something was off. She was too perceptive for her own good. He typed out a quick response, trying to keep it light. Ethan, yeah, just the usual. Nothing exciting. He hit send before he could second-guess himself, but a moment later, his phone buzzed again. Emily Sullivan, don't let them get to you, okay? Remember who you are. Ethan stared at the screen for a moment, her words sinking in. She had always been the one to reassure him, to remind him that he was more than the labels people tried to assign to him. But even as he read the message, Ethan wasn't sure he fully understood who he was anymore, not in this place, not surrounded by people who had always had everything handed to them. Was he really so different from them? Or was it just that he refused to conform, refused to play by their rules? He tossed his phone on the desk, frustrated, and ran a hand through his hair. The truth was, he was tired. Tired of fighting battles that felt like they didn't matter, tired of being the outsider, the one who never quite fit. But more than anything, he was tired of the constant weight of expectation, both his mother's and his own. The next day, Ethan entered his second period class, which was the one he dreaded most. It wasn't the hardest class he had, but it was by far the most draining. It was a history class, but more than the material, it was the dynamics within the room that wore him down. It was where the elites of Westbridge gathered, the ones who had no problem showing off their wealth, their status, their connections. And in that room, Ethan had always felt like an outsider. But this time was different. As he walked in, he immediately noticed that the atmosphere was different. Whispers, quick glances, and the occasional sidelong look, his classmates were all watching him. It wasn't unusual for people to stare at him, especially after a public incident like the one in Ms. Parker's class, but today it felt deliberate. He sat at his desk, ignoring the stares, and began to unpack his bag. The teacher, Mr. Collins, was already standing at the front of the class, but his usual indifference seemed to shift as he scanned the room. It wasn't until Ethan settled into his seat that Mr. Collins spoke up. "All right, class," he said, his tone colder than usual. "I think we can all agree that some of the recent discussions have been interesting. So today, we'll be discussing the role of media in shaping public opinion. And yes, we'll be addressing Emily Sullivan's work, too. the mention of his mother's name in front of the class made Ethan's stomach churn. He hadn't expected this. He didn't even know that his mum's work was going to be brought up in this context. His eyes flicked around the room, noticing the familiar smirks on some faces and the knowing glances passed between others. "Let's start with you, Ethan," Mr. Collins said, his voice cutting through the tension. "What's your take on your mother's approach to journalism?" Ethan's heart raced. Of course they'd all been waiting for this. But the question, coming from Mr. Collins of all people, felt like a trap. Ethan swallowed hard, then stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the eyes on him. This wasn't like his confrontation with Miss Parker. This time, there was no pretense of intellectual discourse. This time, it was personal. "I think my mum's work speaks for itself," Ethan began, trying to keep his voice steady. "She doesn't write for popularity or for clicks. She writes because she believes in exposing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people." There were a few snickers in the back of the room, and a couple of students exchanged glances. But Ethan didn't let it faze him. He wasn't here to win their approval. "She's not trying to make friends," he continued. "She's trying to make a difference. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, then maybe it's a sign that she's doing the right thing." The room fell silent. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Even Mr. Collins seemed taken aback, his usual smug demeanor faltering. Then, as if on cue, Claire's voice rang out from the back of the room. "I think Ethan's right," she said, her words surprising everyone, including Ethan himself. "Journalism isn't about pleasing people. It's about asking the tough questions and holding people accountable." Ethan turned slightly to glance at Claire, but she wasn't looking at him. She was focused on Mr. Collins, her expression firm, resolute. It was strange, seeing her take a stand in this way. But there it was, Claire Hartley, the Queen of Westbridge, supporting him, even if in her own quiet way. For a moment, the class seemed to pause, as if waiting for something more. But then, like a dam breaking, the tension in the room dissipated. Mr. Collins cleared his throat and moved on, but it was clear that something had shifted. Ethan sat back down, his heart still pounding. His mother's career, her struggles, and everything they had fought for had just been publicly validated in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. Even Claire, the one person he'd never expected to back him, had done so. Maybe Claire's words from the day before had struck a chord after all. Sometimes, it's not about winning. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to walk away, but Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to walk away just yet. Maybe it was time to fight a little harder, to stand a little taller. After all, the truth had a way of finding its voice, even in the most unexpected places.